Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. It's good to be back together. I love being able to have conversations like this, and to do it with people all over the world is such a gift. So I'm honored to spend some time with my friend Lyric Gillett. Lyric is the founder and executive director of Faces of Choice, an organization birthed to bring awareness to a demographic of survivors that's gone largely unnoticed, those who were aborted but survived. And Faces of Choice was stonewalled by Fox Sports and prevented from running a commercial featuring abortion survivors during the 2020 Super Bowl. We're going to get into that. But before that, just Lyric from an early age had a passion for truth to lead to goodness that lifts the human condition. And that was nurtured through early education, carried her all the way to Oxford University, where she is today. And when I met Lyric with my wife when we were in Oxford, she was kind enough to give us a glimpse into her fight to change the cultural conversation about abortion through the voices of survivors. That same passion and fight is aimed at addressing some of the most urgent concerns that we all face, the energy crisis, EMPs, these national security risks. Lyric's attention is turned to fighting all of those, and she is courageous and wise in her efforts. She loves spending time with her family, friends, dancing, playing various musical instruments, and exploring the great outdoors and great architecture, which you're immersed in, Lyric, over at Oxford. So, what a joy to get to be back together with you. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Zach. And it was a joy to meet you and Cami and to have the opportunity to not just walk through vestiges of history with you both, but to actually have conversations that recognize the importance of history and why it actually matters to us today. And that we can either choose to carry that torch for good, or that we can completely ignore what has happened in our past and let that impact our present. So it was life giving and joy bringing to have that interaction and conversation with you guys.
Well, we felt the same way. I remember there was one particular wall, you probably remember it, we were walking, and it had been around since like 1300 or something like that. And you were pointing it out. And just that sense of history and continuity, beauty and good and true, you're immersed in that world in your studies. And we'll get into that a little bit because there's so much to pull on there. I want to talk about Faces of Choice and this, just the stonewalling, the friction that you overcame to try to air this commercial. We'll get into all of that. But before we do it, talk about Oxford. You just a moment ago said it's cloudy in Oxford, and that might be true in August. But what's a typical day for Lyric Gillette at Oxford right now in August?
Waking up and before opening my eyes, praying for sunlight. So the nice thing about summer is that it doesn't actually start getting dark until around 9 p.m. Whereas most of the year, I would say the sun rises very late and it sets around 4 p.m. So seasonal depression, a Texan girl had never experienced that before, and now I realize it's actually a real thing. But waking up and like I mentioned earlier, just seeing the history of so much of the modern world and how it's been shaped around you every day when you wake up, seeing the architecture, understanding the difference in, I think, what the perception of beauty used to be as opposed to what it is now. I find, and don't get me wrong, I can appreciate a minimalist perspective when it comes to cleanliness. I do truly appreciate that. But just seeing how everything has almost been broken down in a sense for our perception of what is good, for what is true, this almost deconstruction mindset of what we try to attain. But then looking around at where I am situated now and seeing that legacy was much more of a mindset at that time than it is now, that walls were constructed, or that cathedrals or churches or colleges that were never actually seen to completion by the originator of those ideas and of those concepts, and that the continuity that you mentioned was not just in a historical framework, but in a vision that was passed from one person to the next. And that has just been something that I have really enjoyed immersing myself in the context of Oxford. But the strange juxtapositioning of that is seeing the modern mindset of people today who are living in Oxford. And while they can appreciate the beauty and they can appreciate, to many extent, the truth of what that beauty disseminates, there's still this deconstructionist mindset that is permeating every part. And it's not just our conversations, um, from the day to day or in classes or whatever. But it's seeing how even with the Oxford Union, I'm sure if some of your listeners have been following that, that there are certain speakers where the Oxford Union was almost shut down and disenfranchised because a lot of the student body didn't like certain speakers from coming and sharing their perspective. And the Oxford Union in and of itself is called the bastion of freedom. I mean, that's kind of it's one of the most elite universities in the world, and it is where debate is nourished, and yet we're shutting that down. So I think for me, it's been a very unique day-to-day perspective, and a good way to be a bit introspective about where my ideals, my concept of virtue and what is good, how coherent they are. Because when you're surrounded by beauty, but you're also surrounded by the mindset that in many ways that beauty should be destroyed,
Mm.
um, hopefully it makes you ponder those inconsistencies in yourself as well. But on a happy note, realizing that the stones that I'm walking on every day are older than, everything that I know in Texas, where I'm from. I mean, it's a very, no pun intended, grounding experience that I think brings a lot of gratitude. And so that's where I am,
Mm.
just grateful and, but a bit sober minded as well.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. The grounded and sober minded. And also I hear a note of sadness too. I picked up on that when we were walking through, even as you were describing some of those things, that you're literally walking beneath and shadowed by these incredible structures that point beyond themselves. And there was so
Mhm.
much thought and intention that was creating structures that were reflecting or coherent with reality. And to be walking on those and yet have lost sight of that and have that meaning kind of evaporated or erased, it creates a strange, I could feel it in the air and I heard it in the tone. Where do you go? It's, if you haven't been to Oxford, first go. It's beautiful to get to experience that. And it really is striking to be in a place that is, there's so much history and continuity telling a story. And so I would go. Watch out for bikes. You might get hit by a cyclist. Like, I learned that multiple times. I was not aware of how many just cycling rules I was breaking or not paying attention to. But where do you go on campus right now, or in the city, to find a little bit of, where's your spot? I'm curious where you go to read, to think, to pray. So take us right to that place and why you go there.
So, a little explanation for viewers, because I was not fully cognizant of this until I came to Oxford. Oxford is not one big college. Oxford is composed and comprised of about 39 different colleges. And so, when you type in Oxford University into Google, you are going to be directed to a beautiful edifice that is the Radcliffe Camera. And that's a library, one of the largest in the world. It's either the largest or the second largest, with 13 million books on the premises. And so everything else are different colleges. The college that I took you to, my college, was New College. Probably the most famous and largest college is Christ College. A lot of Harry Potter was filmed at Christ College and a bit at New College as well. Probably my other favorites are Oriel and Magdalen colleges, and they possess rich history, incredible architectural beauty. You can see why both C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were inspired, not just for just the creativity of their mind in general, but so many of the themes that they imbued into their works really are so prevalent just on the campuses and the architecture of these places. I would say personally, I do enjoy going to the gardens of New College. There is a beautiful tree with the mounds that I took you and Cami to, with the flowers surrounding. The wall from the 1100s has a lot of nooks and crannies and places where you can sit and think and study. And it's just, again, a very reorienting perspective that you are surrounded by um, the grounding component of, I guess, the buildings and the stone and the architecture, but also the beauty of nature itself and what is more fleeting, the flowers that you see, dying and coming back with each new season. There's just something that is so, um, it just reorients your frame of thinking. That's the best way that I can phrase it. The nature, which again is a huge component of Oxford, it's not just the architecture; it is the beauty of the nature as well. And so much is put into maintaining that and keeping that going. I mean, there are certain colleges where specific parts of the grass you can't even walk on at a certain time of year without fear of being expelled from the university. I mean, it's serious. And then there's other parts where it's designated as where you bring your each college has their own mascot, a tortoise, and you bring your tortoise once a year for a race, and that's a huge component of just the spirit of Oxford. And they really get into it too, Zach. I think I might have told you and Cami that the year you guys came, the tortoise from Worcester College won, and then immediately after had a heart attack and sadly passed away. So he put his all into that race and he won, put the hare to shame. So, but no, I think for me it is where the nature and the architecture come together, and it's that amalgamation that sets my mind at ease and just makes me be in a place where I can really think about things that matter to me.
Yeah. It feels like that perfect blend. You know, sometimes we think that we have to go flee the city and go back to nature, and that's where true beauty is. But the story is really both and. It's a development story, and that we're given this artistic capacity to cultivate the earth, and it's a both and, to steward the natural, but also to develop and use those things to build and create. And you get a sense of both of those things, and to feel that, I'm sure, what a great place to think and pray. You took us to one spot in particular that struck me. We were in the kind of the foyer of a chapel in at one of the colleges, and you were describing a little bit of the architecture and the art that was in that space. And at the same time, we were getting to know your story and why you were at Oxford, what you were studying. And I remember I had a particular moment that hit me. It was really the catalyst to this conversation, because as we were standing there, we had just met, and you were kindly taking us through the colleges. And as I listened to your story and just heard your voice, even as you reflected on some of the threats that are facing on a national security stage, what you've described at the shifts at Oxford, and then this layer of faces of choice and the fight for the dignity of life. All these things were coming out in our conversation, and I just remember being incredibly grateful for you, for your life, and not just for the opportunity to meet you, but I was listening to you, and I was like, thank you, God, for people like Lyric who who have this courage. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, and what led to this conversation is you embody this virtue that's not a fleeting or changing thing. It is a virtue that we all share, that we're given as humans to be courageous. And you embody it in a way. And I heard it as you talked about, again, the challenges facing Oxford, the challenges facing national security risks, the challenges facing the very dignity of life conversations. That out of you was this really strong courage that kind of was willing to stand. And I was struck by that. And I thought, okay, I want to know more. So that's what led to the conversation. Where did that, I know that it's God given. And so that seed was there a long time ago. Do you have an early childhood memory where you go, after hearing me kind of reflect on that you go, yeah, I can go back in my story, and I remember a moment where I stood up, where I did stand up early on as a child? Was that present in your memory as you look back?
Probably more often than not. Um, I think it's something that really does animate my spirit and who I am. And I owe a lot of that to my parents and just seeing the model that they have put forth, and the discourse that we had. So I was home educated, as I told you and Cami, and my mom suspended a large part of her law practice to home educate me. But I saw things even with my parents early on. They worked with Jay Sekulow before I was born, but I heard stories of to give pro-life individuals the right to pray outside of abortion clinics in Texas. We're not even talking about protests, because at that time that was an actionable offense. You could be arrested for doing that. And so they worked side by side with Jay Sekulow, and were able to actually effectuate that before the Texas Supreme Court. And I think the importance of discourse and dialogue with your children, and it goes back to scripture where it talks about, whether you're rising or setting or going to bed, to always have the word of God and the stories and all the great things that he did in the Old Testament. That was a charge that was given to the people in the Old Testament. And I think that applies just as well today, because I look back on the discourse, and the reason I think this is so natural and intrinsic to me and why I find so much meaning in it is because of the conversations that I had with my family growing up, and the way that my mother home educated me was to realize that this earth that we are walking is not about our own pleasure. Pleasure is so fleeting. Um, you're not going to find satisfaction in that. And the concept of courage and standing up for something that truly matters, it's not just this empathy based, selfish notion of, well, if I were the one who was the victim, I would hope that someone would be courageous enough to help me. Of course, there's something to that. But I think there's so much more. Even you talk about Aristotle's four cardinal virtues. Obviously, you have courage being one of those. But if you look at the others that he paired with that, you have justice, temperance, and prudence. And Andrea, as you know, as it was called in the Greek, is a mean between recklessness and cowardice. So if you ask, is courage this almost social justice kind of mentality of just screaming, what you think is right and demanding and bringing, this essence of almost entitlement or aggression into it? Or is it just better to be more polite and take a step back? I think the mean of that, I know that Aristotle talked about, courage defined has something to do with almost self-directed constructive anger. And that really sticks out to me because from a Christian perspective, that means that you are laying yourself open before the Lord and saying, what inside of me that either tends toward cowardice or recklessness? What inside of me needs to be modeled in a way that is faithful to the charge that you, the author of life, the living God, have given me for me to direct my talent, who I am, whoever I am, to follow you. And honestly, Zach, that as a Christian especially is always going to result in you picking up your cross and following the Lord. Because picking up your cross, that is your instrument of death. If we really want to get down to it, your cross is literally what you expect to die on, the hill to die on, so to speak. So true courage from a Christian perspective, and this is what I have learned, growing up and why it animates everything that brings me passion, everything that inspires passion to me is rooted in this. And it's not because I like to fight. I mean, I am Spartan by blood, so maybe full disclosure, there's something to that. But in interpersonal connection, I'm a calm person. I like laughing. I like having fun. I don't like argument for the sake of argument. I find that meaningless. And I think, again, this comes back to what is the purpose of it? So if we're circling back to picking up your cross, the thing that you would die on to follow Christ, that removes cowardice completely. It defeats cowardice and death, but it also is not reckless because doing it for the greatest purpose and the greatest meaning possible, which is to follow the voice of the living God. And I think that is why the Christian, and I would say the true notion that, yes, definitely mirrors what Aristotle spoke about, but there's more depth to it, because I think that the Christian notion is rooted in faithfulness and in hope. And I think whether you're talking about verses in Romans or Peter, you see that reflection is constantly expressed in faithfulness to the call and hope for what is to come. And if you possess those and you constantly reorient your mind to those things, and then you just see what you're talented in doing, I think that's where you will find true courage. Because today I see so much apathy, but I also see a lot of people doing things that if you take away the meaningful definition, you could say is brave, going out protesting, doing all those things. But what form of self-directed constructive anger, if you will, and I don't mean that in an unbiblical sense, I mean that in a just, righteous anger. What kind of introspection are you first doing, biblically, that would lead you to the path that you're taking? And is this out of a sense of entitlement? Is this out of a sense of, which also, Aristotle spoke against, this almost military self-aggrandizement kind of perspective of courage? I think that's also pretty rampant today as well. And I think if you're going for that, then you're missing the essence of courage. There is self-denial that is involved, which is a perfect picture of Christ. And so, yeah, I think going back to your actual question before I went on my soapbox, the model from my family, the way I was brought up, I did youth and government debate. There were definitely times where that was something that I was doing. I was going against the grain. And for whatever reason, the Lord has protected my heart to not get some kind of high off of going against the grain in and of itself. But it's just that because nobody enjoys being beaten up on unless you have something wrong with you. But, when you have the faithfulness to the call and the hope of why you were doing what you were doing, um, then it comes to light. And I guess the final component that I would add to that is there's something that Jordan Peterson has stated that I really have latched onto, and it is don't hide unwanted things in the fog. And when we come back to talking about faces of choice, I'll revisit that notion. But in some sense, the unwanted things are typically within ourselves. And if we're not willing to stop hiding the things that we're running from, there is going to be a sense of recklessness into running into the fray to feel purposeful and meaningful. You have to clean your own room. You have to clear the fog first and see what's going on. And that's when I think true courage, rooted in picking up your cross, actually will come to bear.
Mm. It's thank you, like, for going back and talking about the foundation that was formed, and even in the introduction, I mentioned like a robust education that laid a foundation for you to develop and become who
Yeah.
you were made to be. And this is what we have. Thank you for that, because it opens up a good conversation for everybody who's listening, who's got kids, parents who are looking at their family and going, wow, this is an exceptional person, Lyric, and she possesses this rare, extraordinary gift, which you do. And also, is who we were made to be. You had the good fortune of having parents who saw the aim of a human life and said, this life is a gift. It's precious. There's dignity and inherent worth in it. This person is made in the image of God, and they have agency and dominion in the world. They wear a crown, and that crown, classically, faith and hope and love, those crown virtues rest on Lyric's head and on the head of all of us and our children in Christ, right? We are this royal priesthood, we're to exercise this way of being a human in the world that must have first faith, a recognition that God exists, right? And hope that he is sovereign, and then love that we're made in his image. Those are the crown that then allow prudence and justice and courage and temperance to flourish beneath that. And so your parents did a phenomenal job of laying that foundation. And that's a call to all of us listening to this episode, right? That's not accidental. You train up children in the way that they are to go. And so those seeds were put deep down in the soil of your life, and they have been nurtured and watered. And now they are bearing this fruit to the point that they come into due season, and you find a hill and you say, okay, human dignity. And this is one of those places where I will die on this hill, that I will stand up for the dignity of life. And I want to shift then with that foundation being laid, right? And not lose that, because everybody listening, like, that is not accidental. That was intentional. That's the way God designed it. And that's true for all of us. We bear that seed of potential that can be nurtured into this mature expression of courage that's not reckless, it's not cowardice, it's what we see embodied in your life, Lyric. And then at some point, we realize that God's put something before us. Why? What's the story then that led you to recognize that it's faces of choice? And you had a moment where you said, this will be one of those hills. Tell us a little bit of the backstory, and then give us the overarching view of what is Faces of Choice. What's the mission and the aim?
So going back to the model that my parents laid, and I can't praise them enough for who they are as people, the exceptional people that they are, ascribing meaning to every conversation. And I think just to quickly finish off the last point too, I think if your children are struggling with enjoying school, whether it's homeschool, private school, or public school, a really important question to start introducing into conversation and dialogue with them is meaning. Why do you think these subjects actually matter? And I'm not talking about the question of, are you ever going to use math later in your life? But there are real conversations, whether it's math, history, or anything in between, about why these are actually meaningful to the human spirit and why God created them as subjects to begin with. So, Faces of Choice, again, I had modeled for me. My parents were fighting before the Texas Supreme Court to simply enable the most powerful weapon that we have, which is prayer. And it was successful. They were successful in what they did. And that level of human empathy was something that was modeled to me all growing up, whether it's through missions like Star of Hope or different organizations that were protecting life, and not just life at the beginning, but life at the end. Euthanasia is a whole other conversation that we could go into. And, we cared for my grandmother in the last stages of her life, and she was an incredible woman, Zach. Spitfire Greek makes me look calm. But her name was Zoe, which means life, everlasting life in Greek. And she was actually born dead. And her mother, in a very biblical prayer, told the Lord, if you will allow this child to come back to me, I dedicate her to you. And all of a sudden, my grandmother, who had been blue, she had turned blue from the lack of oxygen, just the breath of life almost came screaming out of her lungs. And the word that came out of my great grandmother's mouth, which was not the name she intended for her, which was the Greek word for life, Zoe, and that became her name. And so that's always been something close to my heart. And I think another component as well with the home education and the way that my mom modeled things and made things fun was that I like doing things in an unconventional way that make people think maybe I'm a little bit addled in the head. That's the fun that I have. And so, in thinking about the way the pro life movement has been modeled for the longest time, um, it felt like something was missing. And Faces of Choice, as you mentioned, is rooted in a very different way. It's not focused on any of the conversations that are pretty typical to the pro life movement. It changes the dynamic of the conversation, and it is rooted within the voices of people who were aborted, babies who actually survived different types of abortion and are now living to talk about it. And, we hear a lot about the hierarchy of the right to speak, is what I call it, within the abortion dialogue. And what that basically means is that if you're a man, because you never have a capacity to get pregnant, you have no right to voice anything regarding the abortion debate. Next up on that hierarchy is a woman who has never been pregnant. Yes, you're a woman, you have that capacity, but you haven't actuated it yet. So you just kind of need to sit down and be quiet. Above that is the woman that did get pregnant and actually had an abortion. And the argument is that she has the main voice, or should have the main voice, in articulating what happens with respect to policy or anything else in abortion. Now, taking a step back, I don't agree with this with this approach. I think that the capacity to speak for something, right or wrong, does not have any direct relationship to your experiential context to that issue. You can not have been a slave or not owned a slave and still be able to say that slavery is wrong. But if we're going to follow this logical hierarchy that's been set up, that the aborted woman is at the top, in the middle is any woman, and at the bottom is a man, we're missing one key component with experiential relationship, and that is the person who has been aborted and survived the process. If you give this conversation to the people that are most closely related to it, that's who you would give it to. So that's what the thinking was in my head. And one night, I actually woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had a full script in my head, full, 100%. And I woke up and I wrote the entire thing down, and I went back to sleep, and I didn't think about it for a while. And progression of time, at the end of the day, I thought to myself, I want to use this script to bring awareness to abortion survivors. And I didn't decide to do a YouTube video. I didn't decide to do a low-level commercial. I decided I wanted to kill myself and go for a Super Bowl commercial. And so started reaching out, trying to find different survivors of abortion. Melissa Odin is one of the main people that I worked with. She runs the Abortion Survivors Network. And this network is an international network that is finding survivors of abortion all over the world and trying to bring them together to tell them that, frankly, the gaslighting that they have been experiencing for the majority of their lives is unacceptable, that their experience is real, and that there is actual documented proof of this, which we can go into a little bit later. And so the thought, Zach, was that I believe the key to changing the cultural conversation about abortion is within the voices of the survivors. And the reason for that is that every great humanitarian struggle, every great human rights victory of our era has been rooted in the voices of the survivor. Whether you look at Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. with the civil rights movement in the States, or even Ali Wiesel and his experience of the inhumanity of Auschwitz. These faces actually take the concept and the struggle away from this nebulous idea that doesn't really connect to a human spirit, and it gives a face to it, and it animates it, and it gives it a voice. And so that's what I wanted to do with that. And it's funny that you talk about courage as well, because the opening line to this commercial, and there were two commercials, and I'll explain that in a second. But the opening line is, "Will you look me in the eye?
Mm.
Can you look me in the eye?" It's a call to courage because the purpose of Faces of Choice is to say that choice is not merely a word, choice is a person. Because if you look an abortion survivor in the eye and you say, "I supported your mother's choice," what you're in effect telling them is, "I don't support your survival. I supported your mother's choice to end your life." And I think when we start having that dynamic shift in the conversation and people realize that choice has a face, it has a heartbeat, it has eyes, um, that's when this conversation is going to change.
Yeah. When you bring it right to that moment where the conversation changes and you have this, as you say, largely unnoticed voice or unheard voice, and your work brings that voice in. I, even as you say that, I go, and that does not diminish the other voice of a mom who has an experience.
No.
You're simply saying, if we're going to honestly face this,
Mhm.
then it is disingenuous. It's not just to only have one side of that. We have to deal with the
Right.
complexity and the challenge before us to face something really difficult that requires courage, which is to look at both voices and say,
Right.
let's look with empathy and courage, but also justice and prudence at what you've experienced on all sides. And we can speak to that. And even those of us who are a man or outside of it can look at the virtue and reality itself and say, we can have this conversation and we can do that well, but it has to involve both voices. I think that your novel approach, right? Your willingness to think outside of the box, to be rooted in a well-reasoned and understanding the approach that has been taken, and say, I
Mhm.
think there's a different route that is actually more holistic. It's integral to what's real in this conversation. You're doing that in so many ways, but in this, that idea of a commercial comes to you. You don't
Mhm.
go YouTube video. You don't go local television ad.
Right.
You go Super Bowl.
And
And
there's a reason for that.
talk about the reason for that, and just the, I mean, we've all heard the cost of a Super Bowl commercial, and this isn't like in 1982. This was
Right.
2020, and you shepherded that idea all the way from the ideation stage all the way to ready to execute, and then we're not allowed to execute.
Right.
So talk about why you wanted the Super Bowl. What was behind the vision to go to a Super Bowl commercial, the complexity involved in shepherding that from ideation to execution. And then what did you face from Fox Sports?
So, one thing that you mentioned before that I think is worth also addressing is the perspective of the women. You're right. We're not trying to undermine that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this to the Super Bowl is that I did not want to be preaching to the choir. I didn't want to be doing a commercial that is novel and can be given to the pro-life community and everybody pats everybody on the back and then we go home feeling like we did something. I wanted to get through to the average American sitting on their couch who either has never given this any thought or who has personally experienced an abortion, either themselves or their wife or their daughter or whoever it is. I wanted to get through to the average American where this has not become a conversation yet. It's just become something that we do, and then we hide it in the fog. And so that was a huge part of why the Super Bowl was what the target was. And you're right, it was a $5 million target. It was not a small endeavor. Um, Finding the survivors, and again, there was so much shame that unfortunately had been wrapped up in a lot of their stories. Finding them, I mean, I found one in Rwanda who now runs his own orphanage. A wonderful man in Hungary who has saved thousands of lives after surviving 3 abortions himself. Melissa Oden, who I referenced before, is a saline infusion abortion survivor who was burning in a saline solution in her mother's womb for 5 days. And she came out unscathed. It's a miracle. And these, again, have medical documents that actually talk about what they survived. So that is why I wanted to get to the American people, just the regular person who does not have these types of necessarily philosophical conversations from the day to day. And so, my media buyer and I reached out to Fox Sports in July of 2019. We were one of the very first advertisers to reach out and request a spot. And so, we're filling all the paperwork, we're doing everything that's required, we're ahead of the curve, thinking, you know what, we can just have a standard business practice kind of dialogue. If this goes forward, great. If they shut it down immediately, that's fine. We'll reassess and do something else. And so we are given one benchmark after the other. We hop over it. It just continues for month after month after month until we reach November. And again, we had sent all the storyboards over. We had been given enough good faith response that we're like, okay, there's just a few kinks that need to be worked out. This is an overall positive situation. Let's go for it. And so, raised funding, did all of the, what this type of process entails, flew people in from around the United States, had the recording, had camera people go to Rwanda, like different places all over to actually deal with what's happening. Hungary, just all over, South Africa. And so we're getting to this process and having this dialogue with Fox. And so there's two divisions to this. There's the Fox business side and the Fox sales side, the network and the sales. And so sales is very supportive. Things are taking too long. And at one point, the president of Fox sales in Chicago actually flies to New York to speak to the business division to say, what's taking so long? What's the holdup? Why is this happening? So we're having internal advocacy, it seems like, going forward. My media buyer is actually quite positive based on the type of reaction and interplay that she's having. She's been in this industry for almost 3 decades. And so all these things are going forward, and we are told in email that this is not a sellout situation. Don't worry, we just need to work through some things. You're fine. And then November comes around, and we hear not from Fox, who we've been in daily communication with, but through the industry that the Super Bowl is sold out. And again, we're one of the very first advertisers. We approached them in July, had everything together, and suddenly they're sold out. And so I reach out to Fox. I'm not getting any answers as to what happened or why. But my media buyer says, Lyric, look, I've been in this industry a very long time. I know how this works. Inevitably, there will be multiple spots that open up because other companies will drop out. It'll be a controversy or a lack of funding or something will happen. So we need to pursue written acceptance of this ad because when the spots open up, you want to just be able to step into the new opening. And so I said, okay, engaged in further dialogue with Fox Sports. And initially, we were told in December that we would get a response within a week. And then a little bit later, we received an email saying, we've changed our minds. We're not going to respond to anything unless or until a spot opens up. Now, keep in mind, Zach, we've been doing this since July. So it's not feasible to think that, oh, we can't get a response up until this point. Even a no, honestly, would have sufficed, just in accordance with standard business practice. But that's not politically safe, I think, for that to have been the route that was taken. And so we're just sitting on the wings at this point, waiting to see if spots open up. And in January, 6 different spots open up. And so we immediately are engaging again. Have we been approved? Can we step in? We have the funding promise. We have everything we need. Let's go forward with this. And radio silence. And so Jason Yates of My Faith Votes ends up graciously putting together a petition drive for us 3 days before the Super Bowl. And in about 24 hours, we got over 156,000 email signatures and emails that were sent to Fox. It crashed their servers, from what I've been told, demanding that we just get an answer. Not even demanding that they air the ad, even though we've gone through all of this, funded everything, but just asking for the dignity of a response. And this went in lots of different papers. I mean, we had Daily Wire, we had Washington Times. It went all over the place. LifeSite News, everywhere. And only one reporting agency, I can't remember which one it was, got a response from Fox in which they said, oh no, we had no issue with the ad. It's just that everything sold out. They didn't get their application in time. And yet I have documented evidence that we were one of the very first advertisers. So perpetual stonewalling, machinations, the whole 9 yards. That same Super Bowl, they advertised a very controversial drag queen ad for Sabra hummus. So it's not that they were shying away from a political narrative, which is what some people had tried to claim. It's just a specific narrative. And I also want to clarify, I hope that the viewers will go watch these ads after this interview. But I want to clarify that the 30-second spot that we had for the Super Bowl had nothing graphic, It did not even mention the word abortion. That was never even uttered once in the commercial. The only word that was used was the word choice. And it had the faces of some very beautiful survivors talking about, you know, just basically saying, can you look me in the eye and tell me that I don't deserve to exist?
Mm.
That's the kind of conversation that we're trying to start. Nothing graphic. If you didn't go to the website after and actually do some investigative work to find out what they were talking about, you would have had no idea what they were talking about. So there's nothing patently graphic or offensive whatsoever. And so, there was a large media blitz after this. God had his way with how this went together. Um, I had done a 2-minute ad as well that was not for the Super Bowl. It was just the full length. It was to be on the website so people could understand. And that was actually played at the March for Life in 2020, right after President Trump spoke on stage, and they played that ad. So it's had a lot of reach, and I thank God for that. But again, it's not the audience that I've been going for. I'm going for the people that haven't had these conversations, that are not attuned to this, that have not actually realized perhaps the pain that they are experiencing without even knowing it. Again, hiding unwanted things in the fog. And something else that I did is that each of the survivors had their own interview on the YouTube channel after the fact. And one thing I wanted to highlight, Zach, is that every single one of them, without exception, if their mothers were still living, had reconciled with their mothers, told their mothers how much they loved them, that they forgave them. Many of them had a very good relationship with their biological mothers. And I felt that that was something, going back to your early statement about the women's perspective. I did not want them to feel condemned. I did not want them to feel attacked. And I got so many emails from post abortive women after saying, thank you for including this, because the conversation with the child who had survived an abortion is the conversation that I needed with my baby who did not survive my abortion. And
Mm.
hearing those tones of forgiveness and reconciliation, and restoration and healing is everything I needed to hear. So this conversation is not just about saving lives and legacies and futures and the children who will have children and grandchildren who may not otherwise exist, but it's about healing those who are right now the wounded, who are walking around with shame and being told they shouldn't be feeling shame. If our culture is so um, you know, positively minded towards abortion, and yet post-abortive women are suicidal, dealing with all of these, different components of the uptick in breast cancer potential. There's a lot of aftermath to deal with. And in a culture where we're telling them it's just a clump of cells, it's no big deal, there's shame in feeling those things. And so that's another component that I wanted to address here. So when it comes down to it, I think the perspective to walk away with is, at least for me, to rise and rise again till lambs become lions.
Mm.
Um, Keep speaking until the sleeper's awake. And if you're going back to courage, I think the question is, what animates you? It's almost like this Aslan type component of the breath of God animating that which is dormant and dead inside. And so it's the Spirit of God that animates you to courage, that animates you to rise and rise again, but to actually care that those around you who are not standing, who are not awake, will also do the same with you.
Mm.
Um, so that's the tale of what happened. And it did have a happy, um, I won't say conclusion, because Faces of Choice has done projects after that and is nowhere near concluding. But it did have a good view, a good vantage, but it's not where it needs to end.
Yeah.
So
It's when we talk about courage, you hear that story, and the courage to stand up and say, let's reach the Super Bowl audience, the courage to reach out to survivors, the courage to stand before partners and say, we need $5 million, the courage to engage Fox Sports, right? The courage required at every moment of that journey. And I think that what stands out to me is just, you talk about the fog, and it's interesting to me, just even if I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and we have fog out there. And it's interesting when you look at fog, it settles over a particular area, and you can have fog right here, and then right here there's no fog, and it literally creeps to a certain space, and then the fog is not present over here. And it's interesting what you're saying, that it is a success to have the ad played over here, but the fog has settled in over this other sleeping population. And how powerful deception is to say we're going to hold that fog here. And that's where, you can have these conversations out here on the periphery, but when you attempt to come into here, there will be this deception, moving target, shifting. That's what's interesting to me. Fox Business, the only God, the only little g God bigger than money, right? Apparently
Right.
rules something, because the God of money goes, we need I have a $5 million deal to do, and that's
Yeah.
not big enough to open up a window for this to go forward. That's something to recognize, right? That shifting, moving target, vague, that when you see something like that, there's something there to pay attention to. And you said it earlier, the most powerful weapon that we have is prayer, because the battle is not against Fox Business, Fox Sports, Fox. There is something else that brings that fog and holds that fog. And it takes courage to stand up and say that, right? And to say it's not just a visible, but an invisible struggle that exists. And it takes courage to stand up to that, because you face opposition from particular entities, but you also face spiritual opposition for standing up and saying, hey, this is the hill, right? So we have, Riley we were looking at each other, and it was recognizing that we promised you 45 minutes is what we would take up of your time. And here we are. And as I listen to this story, I think, okay, that for our audience, I want them to go see this ad, because really your goal, changing the conversation around abortion. Thank you for that. Thank you for a novel approach that says, in order for this to be a just conversation, we need to bring out this underheard voice. And we just need to recognize that we're not having a complete conversation. We're not there yet unless we're bringing that voice in. So that's a story that we can all help, not only hear ourselves, but include in the conversation as we're having the conversation. So thank you for educating and bringing awareness to us. And I want all of us who are listening to do the same. Yes. Second, we want to be behind Faces of Choice and cheer you on. And I think you mentioned Aslan. There's this beautiful moment where, take courage, dear heart, right? Like,
Yes.
where there's this
Yep.
moment of just a storm, and I don't know if we're going to make it. And this voice comes and says, take courage, dear heart. And we want to be an audience that says that to you, Lyric, and to your team at Faces of Choice, that says, we want to pray that you'll hear that voice from God saying, take courage, dear heart. Like, there's still work to be done. There's still voices to be heard. And I want to give you a chance as we close it out to also then help us, because you have had to rise to in face of great opposition, in face of great challenge, in face of fear, and summon that courage and take courage, dear heart. And this is the hill for you. And I'm glad we could have this conversation, but somebody else is facing cancer. Somebody else is facing the loss of a friendship, the loss of an opportunity, grieving something else. We're all facing this moment where we need that voice that says, take courage, dear heart. What have you learned about the step right after that? Because that is God who will say, take courage, dear heart. That voice will come and we will hear it. And right on the other side of it, there's a call to action. And for that person who just feels weary and like, I've gotten up before and I don't know if I can summon it again, what have you learned that helps you get back up after facing resistance, facing opposition, being told no, having a window open and then immediately closed? For that person who's facing their own moment to take courage, what can you share that you've learned about getting back up and being courageous again?
Zach, as you were talking about idolatry and how, the little god, the lowercase g, um, sometimes money isn't even enough. The one thing that I think is always sacrificed at an altar is life. It's always innocent life. And so maybe innocent life was the one thing that actually they were willing to make that trade for. But it also, Satan is the great imitator, right? Whatever God does, Satan tries to imitate it in lesser and distorted form. So the thing I think for me that the Lord has really spoken into my heart about take courage, dear heart, and what courage really is is that his strength is made perfect in my weakness. And I may have this strong personality where it seems like I don't get tired or weak. I do a lot. I do a lot. I get disheartened a lot. And especially because the human side of things to me, it's not enough to get the job done. I want to take the enemy warriors with me into the light and have that restoration and that resilience come back into their spirit because they are image bearers as well. And so if our strength is made perfect, if you know God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, how is that happening? It's through resurrection power. It always comes back to life. So if Satan is trying to take innocent life and sacrifice it on whatever altar, whatever the conversation, not just abortion, anything, it's always the image bearer of God being destroyed at the altar of idolatry that Satan has set up in whatever context. So the resurrection power is not up to us. What is up to us is my spirit is willing, my flesh is weak. Lord, help me. God, have mercy. And that's really all that it takes. It's a willing heart and a willing spirit. And the resurrection power, the life that came forth from Aslan's spirit, that's nothing that we did. We only received it. And so that exhaustion, the hopelessness, a lot of times when you're in a tunnel, I know growing up, kids play these games when they're in a dark tunnel, driving in a car, and you try to hold your breath till you get to the light, to the very end.
Mm.
And it's kind of this concept of you're in the darkness, you're in the darkness. And the only thing that you can hold on to is God's promise, the hope, and his faithfulness to you of take courage to your heart. And when you get to the light and it almost just comes upon you and in a surprise when you finally see it, you don't expect it. You're hopeless. You think that you have no breath left.
Mm.
And that's when the light comes. And it's not you turning on the light. It's the light that's already there waiting. And so to me, it's that resurrection power, that the same power that raised Christ from the dead lives within you and me. And so irrespective of what that looks like on this side of life, when we are seeing through a glass dimly, when we see him face to face, I think all of this will make sense. And that restorative resurrection power does have power in our life today in the tangible reality of the earth. But even with the pain and however things end up, if these ads never get aired in a way that I would hope that they would, God is sovereign. The resurrection power lays within him. And all we have to do is be receptive and willing to receive it from him. That's it.
Mm. What an extraordinary gift, right? That we don't have to summon the solution, but simply the willingness to ask and to know that it's receptive and that God is there and will meet us right in that place. And Lyric, you embody it. It's inspirational to see those words become flesh and to be able to point to an example, an embodied example, and say, yeah, take courage to your heart, because there's thousands more, right? We know when we get to hear your story, and maybe that bumps up against somebody else's and they say, you're not alone, right? And I hope that can be both sides. You've done that for us. I hope we can do that for you. For people who where can people go to learn more about Faces of Choice, to pray for you, to see and keep up with the story? How do they connect with Faces of Choice?
Well, thank you for that. Facesofchoice.org is where I would encourage everyone to go. When you enter the website, there's some interesting graphics that kind of bring to mind what it looks like for those who have aborted and survived. What if they hadn't survived? Nothing graphic. It's actually beautiful. You get there and you can actually subscribe to our emails. I would encourage that. You're not going to get spammed. You're probably going to get maybe 1 or 2 emails a year, unless we are actually doing something like the commercial. That's when you're going to get sign this, do this. So you're not going to get a lot of overwhelming emails. The other thing I would encourage is to go to our YouTube channel and to see their stories. Don't just watch the 2 commercials, the 30-second commercial and the 2-minute commercial, but spend some time actually looking at people like Hope, who I actually just recently saw her when I was in the States. And she survived an abortion that has left visible physical damage, but her entire life embodies hope and forgiveness. So spend time looking at those stories, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and take the courage, and this is what I would charge every listener with, to respectfully engage with people on this topic, maybe through the Faces of Choice videos, because it's a very different approach, and it really does inspire conversation in a way that I don't think a lot of other takes on this will. It's not offensive. It's literally from the perspective of a survivor. And so I would encourage that. And we have Instagram as well. Follow us on Instagram. The only thing we don't have is TikTok because we were banned on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
So Facebook, Instagram, subscribe on the website, and do subscribe as well to the YouTube channel. And pray, please, because there is definitely an overwhelming sense of, um, is this the right tact? I've done this once before. The Lord blessed it on the pro-life end in the best way he possibly could. But is this the correct tact to approach, in subsequent times? Should I do something different like the World Cup? Or, we've actually received the ability to possibly have a commercial before Good Morning America.
Mm.
But it's decisions like whether or not that is the appropriate use of funds, because that's a few million as well, for something like that. So a lot of wisdom. I need a lot of wisdom, and just to feel the presence of the Lord, the author of life, walking through this with me would be invaluable.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And for everybody listening, we always do this, but pray for Lyric. You know Lyric now. You know her name. And that's part of, we say, these lab life and beauty culturists, people who are tilling the ground and planting seeds and looking for a more hopeful future that is beauty and good and true and uncovers what God has made in the world, right? And points beyond itself to him. So Lyric, your life does that. Your work does that. That's why it's such a joy to share time with you. So please pray for Lyric, pray for Faces of Choice. Go connect with facesofchoice.org, and we'll be praying for you. But take courage, dear heart. You are not alone, and you're a huge inspiration to us. Your life left a mark on Cammie and I. We consider you a friend, and we're grateful for the time. So Lyric, thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate it, and thank you for who you are and what you do.
Thank you for having me on, and for also seeing past just the visible thing and seeing to the essence. I think that there are so few people that do that. And the Spirit of the Lord is so evident on you and Cammie in the way that you actually see the meaning and the life and things that maybe have gone unnoticed. So God bless you guys for your work and your ministry.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the conversation with Lyric Gillett. What a beautiful embodiment of the life and beauty of the gospel. And that's overall, that's the aim of V3 Ministry, to share the life and beauty of the gospel with the world. We do it through the podcast, and we do it through art commissions and publishing. And I want to tell you about a special opportunity on September 5th. We are hosting a live podcast. So Lab, the podcast, will be live at the Orlo House here in Tampa, Florida, to unveil our second visual art commission. It's done by an incredible artist, Gina White. She will be with us live for a podcast and to unveil her work. And I will just tell you, Awake My Soul is the piece, Awake My Soul 2, and it is a beautiful piece of visual art. So join us September 5th at the Orlo House here in Tampa. You can get all the information from our website. We would love to see you there to support the art, to share the life and beauty of the gospel with the world, and to enjoy a live podcast. We love this show when we get to do it live with all of you. So I hope you'll join us September 5th, 6:30 at the Orlo House. Go to our website, vuvivo.com, and we would love to see you there. We'll see you soon.